My name is Jenna Calloway. I'm 31 years old. And the moment my mother picked up her champagne flute at my brother's graduation party, I already knew it wasn't going to be about him. It started the way it always did, with a smile that had nothing warm in it. "To my son Marcus," she said, loud enough for the whole backyard to settle into attention, who always knew what he wanted and went after it, who never took the easy way out, who made this family proud the way a Calloway should. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. Every person standing on that patio already knew who the other kind of Calloway was. My father started clapping before she even sat down. My uncle, the one who had been refilling his glass since 4 o'clock, leaned toward the woman standing next to him, my brother's mother-in-law, and said it just loud enough for 2 tables to hear. At least one of his kids turned out ambitious. A few people laughed, the nervous kind. The kind that means I'm glad it's not me. My sister-in-law didn't bother whispering at all. She said to her friend, who I had met exactly once, "She shows up to every single family thing looking like she's between temp jobs." Then she looked over at me directly, like she was curious whether I'd heard. I had. I looked back at her long enough to make that clear. Then my uncle turned my way, still half smiling, and asked the question he asked every single time I saw him. "Jenna, when are you going to get a real job?" I was holding a glass of sparkling water. I set it down on the table beside me, very carefully, because I knew if I gripped it any tighter I was going to say something I couldn't take back. I looked at my brother, who was standing 3 feet away from all of this, holding his own champagne, not meeting my eyes. He didn't say a word. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. My mother was watching me the way she always watched me when she thought I was about to embarrass her by reacting to something she'd started. Her expression said, "Don't you dare make this about yourself." I looked at my uncle. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother. Then I said, quietly enough that only the people closest to me could hear, "In about 6 weeks, you're all going to wish you'd been kinder tonight." My uncle laughed. "There she goes." I walked to my car. I did not cry in the driveway. I made it home first. Home was a 2-bedroom apartment I shared with nobody, which my family had spent the better part of 3 years framing as evidence of some personal failure rather than a choice I had made deliberately and contentedly. The drive took 22 minutes. I spent the first 10 of them not thinking about anything at all, which is a skill you develop when you've had enough practice swallowing things that would take too long to feel. By the time I pulled into my parking garage, the texts had already started. My mother, "You didn't say goodbye to your brother." My father, "Jenna, call me." My sister-in-law, who had never in 4 years of being family, sent me a direct message about anything. "I hope you know tonight wasn't about you." I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter. Then I stood at the window with a glass of cold water and watched the lights across the street for a long time, until the thing sitting in my chest decided it could wait until morning. The thing about being the child in a family who is always one step behind the story they've decided to tell about themselves. You don't arrive at a breaking point. You accumulate them quietly, the way water gets into old walls. Nobody notices until something gives. The next morning, I went to work. I had been a senior UX designer at a mid-sized product design consultancy called Meridian Studio for 2.5 years. Before that, I'd freelanced for 5, which was the period my family referred to as my wandering phase, as though building a client base and paying my own taxes and health insurance was the equivalent of backpacking through Southeast Asia with no plan. What they called unstable, my clients had called reliable. What they called uncertain, I had called my own. At Meridian, we took on brand and digital experience contracts, primarily retail and regional commercial clients, who were trying to compete in a space where the big players had already eaten everyone else's lunch. We were good at it. We had a small team, aggressive standards, and a reputation for the kind of work that got shared around in industry circles without anyone asking for permission. 3 weeks before my brother's party, I had been promoted to creative director. I hadn't told my family. Not because I was hiding it, but because I had learned years earlier that accomplishments, when brought into certain rooms, have a way of getting dismantled. My mother would ask what it paid. My father would ask if it came with benefits. My uncle would say something about how real stability meant benefits and a pension and a company that had been around long enough to matter. By the end of dinner, I would have walked in proud and walked out smaller. I had stopped feeding things I cared about to rooms that couldn't hold them. So I kept it to myself and went to work, and the voicemails piled up on my phone like something I'd deal with later. My best friend, Carmen, was a high school history teacher with the exact kind of steady, no-nonsense warmth that I had needed since we were 17. She showed up at my apartment on the Tuesday after the party with a bag of groceries and a look on her face that meant she already knew most of it from my 3-line text the night before. She cooked while I talked. I told her everything: the toast, my uncle, my sister-in-law, the silence from my brother, the texts, the voicemails I hadn't listened to. Carmen stirred pasta and didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she asked the question that I had been unable to ask myself. What are you going to do with it? Not what should I do? Not what would keep everyone calm. What was I going to do with it? I didn't know yet, but something about being asked the question directly made space for an answer to eventually form. What I did, in the weeks that followed, was work. I channeled everything I didn't say in that backyard into the most focused stretch of professional output I'd had in years. We had just landed a new pitch, a regional home goods brand, called Hartwell & Co., that was expanding its retail footprint and needed a complete overhaul of its in-store digital experience and e-commerce infrastructure. It was the biggest contract Meridian had taken on since I'd joined. The client was methodical, particular, and not easily impressed, which meant it was exactly the kind of project I needed to be inside of when I had too much energy and nowhere clean to put it. I let the calls from my family go. I listened to one voicemail from my father, who said my name 4 times in 45 seconds, and ended with, "You need to stop being so sensitive about everything." I deleted it without responding. My mother sent 3 texts that each started with, "I don't understand why," and ended with something about my brother's feelings. My brother himself sent one message, on the Thursday after the party. "Mom's upset. Can you just call her?" Not, "I should have said something." Not, "Are you okay?" Just, "Mom's upset." I did not call her. What I did instead was sign off on the first round of Hartwell deliverables, get them in front of the client, and receive feedback that the creative director called the clearest strategic vision we've seen in 2 rounds of pitching. I read that email 3 times, not out of vanity, but because I needed to hear something true in a language I trusted. The thing about doing good work, when people have spent years telling you that you're not serious, it doesn't fix what they said, but it gives you somewhere to stand. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, 5 weeks after the party, that I got a call from our client liaison at Hartwell. She asked me how familiar I was with a regional furniture retailer called Calloway Home. I sat very still for a moment. "Somewhat familiar," I said. She told me that Calloway Home had submitted a proposal in response to an adjacent contract. Hartwell was issuing a vendor integration project connected to the digital expansion we were already leading. They were looking for partners who could supply certain custom fixture components for their new store formats. The Calloway proposal had made it to the evaluation shortlist. Standard procedure required Meridian to flag any potential conflicts of interest before the client made final decisions. She asked if there was anything I needed to disclose. I told her I would send a formal written disclosure within 24 hours. Then I sat in my office chair for about 4 minutes doing nothing, which is not something I do often. My family's business was on a short list for a contract that ran directly through my desk. Not because I had arranged it, not because I had tried to create any kind of leverage, but because the world is occasionally that specific in how it chooses to make a point. I filed the conflict disclosure. I was transparent with our principal about the relationship. She appreciated it, noted it formally, and told me that my professional role in the evaluation would be limited, but that my creative direction on the larger Hartwell project would continue as planned. She also told me, without being asked, that the Calloway proposal had some significant gaps in its digital integration specs that would likely need addressing before any approval could move forward. That night, I wrote in the notebook I kept on my nightstand. I wrote about the backyard, I wrote about the toast, and the champagne flute, and the way my brother had held his drink and said nothing. Then I wrote about what it feels like to be dismissed by people who love you without knowing the full version of who you are, and what happens when the full version shows up in a room they weren't prepared for. I didn't post it anywhere. I just needed to write it down so it could exist somewhere outside of my body. The calls from my family had been consistent but irregular for 5 weeks. Then, on a Friday afternoon, something changed. My phone started ringing in clusters. My father twice before noon. My mother at 1, at 2:15, at 3:40. My uncle, who I heard from approximately never once, at 4. My brother, at 4:30. I was in the middle of a client review session. I let them all go. By the time I got to my car, I had 11 missed calls and a text from my father that said only, "It's important. Please call." I drove home. I made dinner. I did not call. The next morning, my sister-in-law texted, which, given that her last message to me had been to explain that my brother's graduation party wasn't about me, was notable. She said, "I know things have been weird, but we really do need to talk to you." I texted back 3 words. About what, specifically? She didn't answer. My brother called that evening and I picked up, which surprised both of us, I think. He started with small talk, which I let run for about 45 seconds before I said, "Marcus, what's going on?" He told me Dad had gotten word through a contact at Hartwell that the vendor evaluation was connected to a larger project being led by a design firm. Someone had put the pieces together. My family hadn't known that I worked on anything touching Hartwell's account. They had submitted the proposal on their own, before any of this was relevant. But now they understood the situation. He said, "Dad wants to talk to you about the evaluation." I said, "Dad can call me himself." Silence. Then, "He's worried you're going to tank the proposal because of what happened at the party." I looked at the ceiling of my apartment for a moment. "Marcus," I said, "I filed a formal conflict disclosure the day I found out. My involvement in the evaluation is already limited. The proposal will be reviewed on its merits. I'm not going to do anything unethical, because my feelings are hurt." Then I paused. "But if the proposal has gaps, and I've been told it does, those gaps need to be fixed by whoever submitted it, not by me." He was quiet. "You should have said something," I told him. "At the party. 1 sentence. That's all it would have taken." He didn't argue. He just said, "I know." That was the first honest thing anyone in my family had said to me since June. My father called the next morning at 8:15. I made coffee first, then I answered. He started with "Sweetheart," which I recognized immediately as the register he used when he wanted something. Not the register he used when he was sorry. Those sound different, and I had learned to tell them apart years ago. He said the business had been in a transition period. He said the Hartwell contract would make a significant difference to the 3rd location they'd opened the previous spring. He said he understood there might be some tension between us right now, but that he hoped I could look at this as a business matter and set personal things aside. I said, "Dad, do you know what I do for work?" Pause. "You do design, graphics or something." "I'm the creative director at a product design consultancy," I said. "I lead digital experience strategy for retail clients. That is what I have been doing, at increasing levels of responsibility, for 7 years. I have been telling you this at family dinners for 7 years." Silence. "I'm not going to interfere with the evaluation," I said, "but I'm also not going to use whatever professional proximity I have to paper over gaps that your team should fix. If the proposal is strong enough, it moves forward. If it isn't, it doesn't. That's the same standard that applies to every other company on that shortlist." He said, "I just think that family—" "Don't," I said, quietly. "Don't use that word right now. Because 6 weeks ago, family meant I sat at a table while you let everyone tell me I wasn't good enough, and you didn't say a single thing." The silence on the line was different after that. Less strategic, more uncomfortable. He said, "Your uncle went too far. I know that." "You went too far," I told him. "At least one of my kids turned out ambitious. You were clapping." He didn't answer that. I didn't expect him to. We agreed to meet the following weekend. His suggestion, not mine. He said he wanted to have a real conversation. I told him I was only interested if it was actually real. He said he understood. I wasn't sure he did, but I went. They lived 40 minutes from me in the house I grew up in, which had been renovated twice since I left, and now looked like a different version of a memory. My mother had set out coffee and the kind of pastries she bought when she wanted a gathering to feel civilized. My uncle was not there, which told me my parents had made some calculation about how that would land. My brother was there. My sister-in-law was not. My father sat at the head of the table. My mother stood near the counter for the first several minutes, which meant she wasn't ready to commit to whatever the tone of this was going to be. I sat down. I did not take a pastry. My father began with a version of what he'd said on the phone: the business, the contract, the difficult year, the third location. He spoke for about 4 minutes. It was coherent and entirely beside the point. When he finished, I said, "I don't want to talk about the contract. I want to talk about the party." My mother made a small noise from the counter. My father said, "Jenna, say what you said," I told him, out loud, in this room. He looked at the table. "You said at least one of my kids turned out ambitious." I said it for him, since he wasn't going to. "In front of your guests, your son's in-laws, and me. And you clapped for the toast that came before it, where Mom said Marcus never took the easy way out, which was specifically meant to contrast with me, and everyone in that backyard knew it." My mother turned fully toward me for the first time. Her face had that expression, the one she'd always worn when she thought I was about to make something difficult for her. "It was a celebration," she said. "We were celebrating your brother." "You were diminishing me," I said. "There's a difference. You can celebrate him without that. You chose not to." "You're so sensitive," she started. And then she stopped, because I was already shaking my head. "That's not going to work today," I said. "I've been hearing that my whole life, and I've been letting it land for my whole life, and I'm not doing that anymore. Telling me I'm too sensitive is a way of making my reaction the problem, so that the thing you did doesn't have to be." Nobody said anything. My brother was looking at the table. Then he looked up. "She's right," he said. "I should have said something. I didn't. And that was wrong." My mother looked at him like he'd broken rank on something. "He is right," my father said, finally. Slowly. Like the words were heavier than he'd expected them to be. "We were the mood got away from us. Your uncle shouldn't have said what he said. And I should have shut it down instead of laughing. Should have stopped at 2 kids," I said. He closed his eyes for a second. "I know. Do you know what that does?" I asked him, not rhetorically, actually asking. "Do you understand what it feels like to hear that from your father in front of 30 people? "No," he said after a moment. "I don't think I've let myself understand it." That was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. I wasn't ready for it. I sat with it for a moment before I continued. I told them what I had decided. Not about the contract that wasn't mine to decide unilaterally, and I had already handled it properly. I told them what I had decided about myself. I was not going to keep showing up to family events where I was expected to absorb comparison and mockery and silence in exchange for access to people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I was not going to keep performing okayness so that everyone else could stay comfortable. I was not going to keep explaining my career to people who had already decided it didn't count, or defending my apartment, or justifying the fact that I was 31 and still finding my way on my own terms. If they wanted a relationship with me going forward, certain things needed to be true. No jokes about my job, my apartment, my choices, no toasts that used me as the counterexample. No allowing other people, specifically my uncle, specifically my sister-in-law, to say things at family events that they would never have said if I were someone they respected, while everyone else stayed silent. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," I said. "I'm asking you to try. If something like this happens again, I'm going to leave. Not dramatically, I'm just going to leave." My mother had been crying for about 10 minutes by then. Not loudly. The quiet, ashamed kind, which was harder to be in a room with than the loud kind because it didn't give me anything to push against. She said, "I didn't realize how much we'd been doing this." "I know," I said, because I believed her. That was almost the saddest part, that it had been so habitual it had stopped registering as a choice. My father asked, finally, the question he had been building toward since I walked in. "What about the Hartwell contract?" I looked at him for a long moment. I've already done everything I'm required to do, I said. I disclosed the conflict. My involvement in the evaluation is appropriately limited. The proposal will be reviewed fairly. I paused. I also told you the proposal has gaps. Fix the gaps. That's all I can tell you. And if it doesn't go through? Then it doesn't go through, I said. That's not my problem to solve. I'm your daughter. I'm not your contingency plan. He nodded. He looked older than I remembered him looking, which was probably just what happened when someone you'd made small finally looked you in the eye and stayed there. My brother walked me to my car. We stood in the driveway for a minute, in the way you do when you have more to say than you have words for. I'm sorry, he said. Really, I should have been better. Yeah, I told him. You should have. I wasn't angry at him exactly, but I wasn't going to smooth it over either. I need you to be better going forward. That's what matters now. He nodded. I'll try. I believed him, in the partial way you believe someone when you've watched them fail you once, and you're giving them a second chance at the cost of managing your own expectations carefully. I drove home with the windows down. It was late September, and the air had just started to turn, and I thought about how long I had been carrying the version of myself that family needed me to be, the one who was smaller than her actual life, the one who apologized for her work, her apartment, her choices, the one who sat at tables where she was the punchline and kept showing up anyway because she thought staying was what love required. That version of me had been earning nothing for years. The Hartwell evaluation concluded 3 weeks later. Calloway Homes' proposal made it through a revised submission. My brother had apparently found someone to address the digital integration gaps, and they were approved as a secondary vendor, not the lead contract. A supplementary one, smaller in scope. The decision had nothing to do with me, which was exactly as it should have been. My father sent me a text that said, "We got approved for part of the contract. Thank you for being fair." Then, a few minutes later, a second one, "I mean that. Thank you." I didn't respond right away. Not because I was punishing him, but because I wanted to sit with the fact that fairness had become something he felt he needed to thank me for, and what that said about how low the bar had been before. I texted back eventually. I was just doing my job. Then, because it was true, I added, I'm glad it worked out. October felt different. I bought a new chair for my apartment. A real one. From an actual furniture store. Not a second-hand find. And put it by the window where I like to read. Small thing. But it was mine. Chosen for no reason except that I wanted it. Carmen came over that weekend, and we cooked too much food and watched a movie neither of us had seen, and at some point she said, "You seem lighter." I didn't disagree. My mother called on a Tuesday night. Not to ask about anything, not to relay a message, just to talk. She asked how work was going. I told her about the Hartwell project, actually told her the scope, the creative approach, the part I was most proud of. She listened. She asked a question that showed she'd been listening. It was such a small thing. It should not have been notable, but it was. Before we hung up, she said, I've been thinking about what you said. About the toasts. About the patterns. She paused. I think I used you to make other people laugh because I thought you could take it. I thought it meant I wasn't worried about you. I think I was wrong about what that meant. I didn't tell her it was okay. Because it wasn't, entirely. And I was done offering absolution in advance of evidence. But I told her I appreciated her saying it. That I meant what I said, that I wasn't looking to end anything. I was looking for it to be different. Different is hard for me, she said. I know, I said. Try anyway. She said she would. I decided to believe her enough to give it a chance, which is different from trusting completely, and that difference mattered. Thanksgiving was 8 weeks away. I told Carmen I wasn't sure I was going. She said, "What do you want?" I thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, which I hadn't always let myself do. I want to go, I said. But only if it's actually different. Not performed different. Actually. Then tell them that, she said. So I did. I called my mother and told her I was thinking about coming, and that I needed her to know what that would require. No comments about my apartment or my job. No letting my uncle make the joke he always made. No toast that used anyone in the family as the cautionary tale. She listened. She didn't defend herself this time. She said, "I'll talk to everyone before you come." "If it happens anyway," I said, "I'll leave, and it won't be a big moment. I'll just go." "I understand," she said. "I don't know yet how Thanksgiving will go. I genuinely don't. That is something I've had to make peace with, that there's no version of this where I get a guarantee. No contract, no letter, no legal structure that promises the people in that room will have done the work. All I can control is what I accept when I walk in, and what I do when things go wrong, and whether the version of me sitting at that table is the one who belongs to herself, or the one who belongs to their version of the story. I'm planning to go. I've bought the wine I like, the kind I used to not bother bringing, because someone always had a comment about whether it matched anything. I'm going to bring it anyway. And if my uncle asks when I'm going to get a real job, I'm going to look at him calmly and say, "I'm the creative director at a design consultancy. I've been doing this work for 7 years. Ask me something real, or let's talk about something else." Then I'm going to pour my wine. Because here's what I finally understand. The thing I spent 31 years learning the hard way. The people who need you to stay small will always find a way to frame your growth as a threat. They will call your confidence arrogance. They will call your limits attitude. They will call your silence a tantrum, and your presence an obligation, and your success a coincidence. And they will keep doing all of that for exactly as long as you let them. The moment you stop performing smallness for their comfort, that is the moment they either rise to meet you or show you exactly who they were the whole time. Neither one is your fault, but only one of those outcomes is your problem to carry. My name is Jenna Calloway. I am 31 years old. I have a job I worked for, an apartment I chose, and one non-negotiable standard for the people I share a table with. They have to be willing to see me accurately. That is not too much to ask. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment where someone in your family finally saw you the way you'd been trying to show them for years? Or are you still waiting for it? Drop it below. I want to know where you're watching from and what your story sounds like. I'll read every one.